Hey everybody, Ivan here. A little bit of a different video today. We won't be doing any shooting, but what I'd like to do is talk about something that probably seems outside of the scope of a 3D printed gun sort of channel. What I'm talking about is something that gets brought up fairly often in questions whenever I post videos of myself shooting various sorts of guns. That question revolves around why is it that I place my finger on my trigger finger on the trigger in the way that I do, and why is that different from what a given individual was taught? Most of these comments seem to come from Reddit, and I should probably just realize that coming from Reddit, they're not in good faith. But I'm willing to entertain it anyway, because I've seen these questions now from YouTube, Twitter, everywhere ends up asking them. It's just usually from Reddit that people are very, very concerned about how I'm pulling the trigger on a particular gun. So as best I can gather, there's this notion, which I'm going to call a myth, really, that the only possible way to place your finger on the trigger of a firearm is if you take the middle of the tip of your finger, so we're going to call finger segments 1, 2, and 3. Take the third segment of your pointer finger, place it so that the middle of that pad engages on the middle of the trigger, and that's the only way that you're allowed to pull the trigger on a firearm, regardless of how big your hands are. I've got rather large hands. Regardless of what grip is on your firearm, and regardless of where the trigger is in relation to that grip. Of course, whenever it's put that way, it kind of seems silly, because of course there's a wide variety of hands. There's people with big hands, small hands, fat hands, skinny hands, all sorts of things. Not to anyone's particular detriment, but those factors exist, as well as the fact that if you compare just a Glock here to a 1911, there's a very obvious difference in both the angle from where the web of your hand sits down to where the trigger is. On the 1911, it's essentially straight back. On the Glock, it's at a downward angle. As well as the sort of relative spacing and thickness of the grips. There's a lot of differences that play in here that all have to do with the sort of mechanics involved in pulling the trigger. So this is where I start getting my caveats out of the way. I'm not professing myself to be any sort of professional shooter. This is not advice. I'm not telling you what to do. This is purely meant to be me explaining why it is that I do what I do. Me sort of pointing out why I don't follow the advice that's purported by this myth, effectively. And perhaps if you feel that you want to try something that I say here, feel free, so long as you do it in a safe manner. I'm not going to teach you to do anything unsafe, but don't take anything of what I'm saying here as gospel, because I'm certainly no expert when it comes to teaching. I'm not any sort of certified instructor or any of these sorts of things, but I do feel like I have a decent understanding of the mechanics from my sort of background in designing some of these things. So, from a very, very basic core concept, whenever you're pulling the trigger of the firearm, we'll start with our Glock here, just for example, what you want to ensure is that whenever the trigger breaks, as you're pulling the trigger, as you're pulling the trigger back to the point it breaks, and as it breaks, you want the sights on the firearm to stay perfectly aligned, and you don't want to have your trigger pull be, a very bad example is if you were just using like a horrible grip like this, right? Like the worst possible grip. As you're pulling the trigger here, the gun's gonna, muzzle twists up or it twists to the side. You wouldn't want that, and that'd be hard to control. So with a good proper grip, and depending on how you place your finger on the trigger, that can affect, actually, how the gun moves as you take up the trigger and as it breaks. The way from a mechanical standpoint I understand this, and I will purport this to be good advice and stuff that you should at least try to follow, because, at least on paper, it makes perfect sense. Whenever you get that trigger to break, you want the force that your finger is applying to the trigger to be coming straight back to whatever your rearmost point of contact is. With a handgun, that should be the web of your hand, unless you're doing something weird. With a rifle, that's the stock and your shoulder, assuming you've got a stock or a brace on a pistol or what have you. It's whatever the rearmost point of contact between the gun and your body is. So, back to our Glock. We have the sort of backstrap of the pistol in the web of our hand. As we're pulling the trigger, we want to be pulling the trigger straight back to the middle of that web of our hand. That ensures that when the trigger breaks, we don't twist the gun to one side or the other, and it's just the striker moving forward and the gun firing without us twisting it one way. Of course, when you have a support hand, you can push harder with your support hand, so much more goes into this than just your trigger pull, of course. But the trigger pull can be one particular place, especially for new shooters, that gives them trouble. Especially if you try to anticipate recoil and you jerk the trigger down, that can sort of add to the issue. So, wrapping back around to this idea of everyone has to hold the gun the same and have their finger on the trigger in the same place. I'm here to tell you that, at least for me, that's wildly untrue. I've built this Glock, designed this frame to sort of fit into my hand so that it is true, right? This was an experiment sort of thing, so that you can sort of see. I've got my finger, as the myth states, the middle of the tip of my finger right there on the trigger. As I pull backwards, I'm pulling, this tip of my finger is pulling straight rearwards. And when the trigger breaks, the muzzle of the gun doesn't twist one way or the other. So it's good and proper. Fits my hand well in that regard. Now, the reason that this sort of then causes trouble is, imagine if this grip were maybe a millimeter cut deeper, and maybe this trigger was moved a millimeter back. If that were the case, we'd be a little bit closer to this little shield, how it fits my hands. Whenever I go to grab this thing, as soon as I start taking up the trigger, you can see my finger is already at a 90-degree angle. So when the trigger breaks, you can see I'm pulling that way with my finger, which is going to cause the gun to break over. I found when shooting this gun, if I instead have the trigger ride right there in my knuckle, I can land accurate shots with this silly, itty-bitty little thing, 40, 50 yards, no problem. Meanwhile, if I do this silly thing that the myth teaches, I'll have trouble hitting stuff at 15 yards. So that's an interesting caveat. And this is all sort of driven by the fact that when you look at how your finger works whenever you go to pull a trigger, it curls, right? There's no part of your trigger or your finger that can actually just move straight rearward unless you bend your finger at a 90 degree and then pull backwards with your elbow. But that's not how you should be using a trigger, at least. I will again purport that that's probably not correct and won't be conducive to controlling the gun or getting accurate shots. So you have to have a firm grip with your hand, which leaves your trigger finger to curl. So as you go and curl your trigger finger, that's difficult to say, as you go to curl your trigger finger, depending on where the gun sits in your hand, where the grip sits in your hand, and where that trigger actually is, you'll run into different places that you need to put your finger, such that as it rides the trigger, when the trigger breaks, you're actually curling your finger straight rearward. So that's essentially the gist of what I'm trying to say here. And so, of course, I've brought along a couple of different props to sort of show you, at least with my hands as the constant exemplar, what difference that actually makes. So if we go to take a 1911 here, I learned to shoot on 1911s, and of course I was given the same lesson of it's always the tip of the pad of your finger, but it just so happens that 1911, sort of like this Glock, fit me perfect, where you can see my finger's about at a 90, the take-up's up, it's still not quite at a 90, and at the moment the trigger breaks, make sure we're empty there, at the moment the trigger breaks, I'm pulling straight rearward. So with 1911s, the adage does hold true for me in these hands. Where I start to run into more of an issue is, again, pistols with slimmer grips I'll have trouble with, as well as pistols that have not as much meat between the trigger and the back strap. So like Browning high powers, I don't have a frame handy, but with Browning high powers, I'm at the crook of my finger, like with the Shield, rather than the Glock or the 1911 here. Where you run into see, at least with my hands, a big difference is with rifle grips. Rifle grips, because they don't have a magazine going through them, of course, tend to be much slimmer and much less long this way. So whenever I go to try and grab a hold of an AR-15, when I grab it, my trigger finger sort of naturally wants to be there. And that natural intuition is correct for when I go to shoot. This may be sort of tricky to see with the lighting. Try and point it forward there. But as I go to curl my trigger finger, there's the point where it's sort of resting on the trigger for take-up. And if I keep curling, I'll pull straight backwards for when the gun actually would fire. Meanwhile, if I do the tip of my trigger finger, you'll see it's at a 90 degree before any take-up. And at the point it breaks, I'll keep it held down. See if I can show it to the camera. Twist my arm around there. You can see my trigger finger is bent much past the 90 degree angle. And, like inside of 10, 15 yards with the rifle, it doesn't matter. But as you scoot back to 100 or 200 or 300, especially if you shoot trace, as I've done a lot with these this 308 build here, you can really see how you think you got the sights dead on. You go to pull the trigger, but you don't have enough of your trigger finger on the trigger. and you'll actually, especially with tracers, you can see the shot get pulled. So you think you have your sights right, you take your shot, and then you see the tracers like over here. And it's just because as you were pulling the trigger, at the moment it broke, you sort of crooked the barrel of the gun over that direction as you broke the wall and resistance in the trigger. Just for fun, we can show you here on the set-me, there was a little bit of a bear to cock. So we have the gun on fire here. The set-me, much like the AR-15, has a fairly short grip. So where my trigger finger wants to be is about there at the crook. And there we've got take-up. And for the moment the trigger breaks, we're coming straight backwards. But that's where I have to hold it to ensure that happens. If I do the sort of bad advice where you do the middle of the tip of your finger all the time for all guns, of course, it's difficult to show you, but maybe I can get it here. At the moment the trigger breaks, you see my trigger finger is past the 90-degree angle, and because of that, I can't possibly be pulling straight backwards, because my finger moves through an arc. So that sort of highlights what it was that I was trying to say as far as why does Ivan do the funny thing where he grips the trigger with so much trigger finger? Haha, that's weird, he doesn't know what he's doing. Well, true, maybe I don't know what I'm doing, but this is what I have found works exceptionally well for me. Which brings me to my next point, which is, broadly speaking, if somebody, instructor or otherwise, is going to look you dead in the eye and say, the way that you're shooting, which is accurate and good and consistent and wonderful, you get good results with, if they're telling you that's wrong and what you should instead do is something that makes you shoot worse, you shouldn't trust that person's credentials, because they're trying to sell you a one-size-fits-all thing, when we can very obviously see different size hands, grips, triggers are going to greatly confuse that. So that's sort of what I want to harp on there, is there's people who will try and sell you this one-size-fits-all, and oddly enough, there seems to be a fairly large Venn diagram overlap of, it seems to be people who think that this is the sort of pistol that you should always shoot, and that the correct way to hold it is like this, with the teacup method. So there's a little bit of confusing messaging out there, and I think a lot of this is due to the fact that, from all the people I've talked to in military basic training, they do teach you that the correct and only way to shoot an AR-15 is with, regardless of the size of your hand or the grip of the trigger, the middle of the tip of your finger must go on the middle of the trigger, and there is no other way to shoot the gun. And on Twitter especially, I've chatted with a lot of guys who went through basic training and said, they were telling me, they could not shoot well at all like that. And as soon as they went back to shooting how they knew they could shoot, they were shooting much better than they did at basic training. And that sort of told me something, that there's, at least in military communities or whatever, it sort of fosters this idea that shooting wrong is shooting right because they said it's right, instead of shooting accurately and good and consistently is right because it's better, if that makes any sense. And so for a final example here, we've got our little ridiculous Draco Ak. I brought this out because it's a good example of an incredibly skinny pistol grip. I mean, this thing's very slim, not very large front to back like this. Just to sort of show you, I can pull this trigger straight back, and the trigger's pretty close to the crook between my first and second segments on this trigger when I go to pull it. So it looks like that is where I know is good and straight back, but like you have your whole entire finger wrapped around the trigger, and that's just a fault of this grip being no good. With those super chunky overmolded Hogue grips, which I really like on AKs because of my huge hands, I can get closer to the crook between my second and third segment on my finger, but very consistently, if I do that with this sort of a grip, I'm pushing the muzzle over to the right or the left. The right or the left. I thought about doing a sort of shooting demonstration of these sorts of things, these concepts, and pulling the trigger left or right, tweaking the gun one way or the other based on how much finger you have on the trigger. But the problem is there's going to be the one guy in the comments who's like, well, you obviously faked it. So, it's difficult then, right? So I figured I'd try and keep things more purely with the mechanics. So hopefully most of you guys are with me. My explanation's been clear as far as you want the trigger at the moment it breaks for your trigger finger to be coming straight back to your rearmost point of contact, be that the stock, the web of your hand, whatever your particular weird setup beyond that is. Now finally, as far as and this is probably the least warranted, least asked for thing ever, how would I recommend you improve if you're not sure about trigger finger placement? You've had trouble shooting handguns or rifles or what have you, and you suspect it's your trigger finger placement or trigger pull that's giving you trouble. So the thing that was recommended to me that worked really well was two things. The first was dry fire practice. The dry fire practice I was recommended was specifically with a 1911, but you could do it with a Glock. Where you take your gun, you make sure it's clear, of course, and you put an empty shell casing on the front sight, and then you go and pull the trigger. And if you're pulling the trigger straight rearward at the moment it breaks, and you're not flinching, the shell casing will just stay balanced perfectly on the front sight. If you're breaking the gun over because of your trigger pull, or you're flinching because you're anticipating recoil even in dry fire, which happens, the shell casing will fall off the sight and you know you've done it wrong. And the other thing that helped me a lot was a different person, but more or less same advice, is you get a laser that you can put on your gun. And I know people make a lot of fun of lasers on handguns because it's, I don't know, hood rat tactical or what have you. But what I was recommended was you put this laser on, if it's a rifle, you can put it on a rifle, but normally people have the most trouble with handguns. So you mount your laser on your pistol, and then you go and point your laser. You go and sit in a room, and you point your laser at the sort of tri-corner between your roof and a wall. So you point the laser dot right in that corner, and you focus to get that laser dot as still as you can, and then as you go and pull the trigger, the laser dot shouldn't jump or flinch or tweak one way to one side or the other. And you'll know that you found the perfect spot, and you can try different spots on your finger as you dry fire, and you'll know you have the perfect spot when you can consistently get that trigger to break, and the laser dot doesn't tweak left or right. Or, and if it tweaks down, then you're anticipating recoil, and there's strategies that can be done with that, but you want to consistently be able to not tweak the laser dot as you're doing that. So that sort of unwarranted, unasked for advice out of the way, just sort of an explanation of how I conceptualize this and how for a particular gun, like whenever I have a new combination of gun or grip or something that I can't immediately figure out, that just doesn't feel natural and I can't hit stuff with, I'll mount a laser to it, I'll do dry fire practice with it, and so point it at that corner, and then dry fire it until I find a place on my trigger finger where I can pull the trigger straight backwards at the point it breaks. I'm not tweaking the gun one way or the other. And this sort of lesson has worked very well for me. Maybe it'll work for you, maybe it won't, and I'm just prattling. But this has hopefully been a decent explanation that I can use as a reference in the future when people hit me with why are you pulling the trigger like that? You can't pull the trigger like that and hit anything. When in reality, you can. In fact, with this particular gun, albeit with a little bit bigger scope, I've run it out at 400 yards and been able to hit 6-inch plates consistently with it. If I'm able to do that with the funky crook of my finger, maybe there's something to it. I don't know. But there's my explanation, there's my justification for why it is that I do goofy things, and hopefully this will help some people who have been told what I purport is a bad myth that isn't very great advice to deal with situations that they may run into where they feel like they can't hit anything, but they're sticking to this bad advice. And then final thing I'll say is, when it comes to taking new shooters shooting, which I think is probably where this myth comes from, is it's one of the first things you're told about how to shoot, is like, you pick up the gun, well, how do I put my finger on the trigger? And they tell you, oh, it's right there, put that right on the trigger. I think a lot of people learn that very early on, and they just come glued to it. But I think that is a useful technique for teaching new shooters to shoot, because with new shooters, the primary goal, especially for you observing them or helping them or introducing them to shooting, is keep them from shooting themselves or anyone around them, more so than it is having them shoot very accurately, until they get to the point that they are not freaked out around the gun or nervous around it. Then you can start working on fundamentals and stuff like this. So I think that this myth does have its place, but I don't think that place is like coming on every single Reddit post a guy makes and saying, oh, why are you pulling the trigger like that? Because I'm pulling the trigger like that because it works. And if it works, it works. Anyway, hopefully the mechanics explanations and these sorts of things have been useful for you. And hopefully if you're running into trouble, maybe it'll help you. Maybe it won't. We'll have to see. Anyway, this has been a rather long video, and we'll call it quits here. Thanks.